Hello, welcome back. We're going to solve inequalities using or involving absolute value. Now, at this stage of the game, before we do these problems, if you have not watched the last section, you must go back to the last section and watch the first part of it at least. Because I go over a few things with how you interpret these inequalities that you must understand, and I go over it in a lot of detail. So if you haven't watched the last lesson, go watch it right now. Here's our first problem. Absolute value of x is less than 2.5. Now obviously there's not much to solve here, but we're going to get some practice translating this into the kind of problem that we can then graph. Now again, we talked about this a lot in the last section. What this problem is telling you is that x, no matter what it is, or the range of values that satisfy this, basically has to be less than 2.5 units away from 0. So if you go over here to a number line, I'm going to graph it in a second, but basically here's 2.5 and here's negative 2.5 right here. So this is 2.5 units away from 0, and this is 2.5 units away from 0 in the other direction, right? So what this is saying when you have an absolute value here is that whatever goes in here is got to be less than 2.5 units, because the less than sign, less than 2.5 units away from 0. So that means that the solution is basically going to be a line segment that is going to look like an and kind of problem. So the way that you write it down is you put your variable in the middle and you say that it has to be less than 2.5, because we're saying that the values of x have to be less than 2.5 units away from 0, so less than 2.5, but also greater than negative 2.5. These are the only range of values that work. So whenever you have an absolute value of something less than a number, it's always going to look like an and kind of problem, a compound inequality that looks like this. Now normally we would take this half of the inequality and solve it, and then take this half of the inequality and solve it, but effectively there's nothing to solve here because the problem was so simple. So the way you graph it is you put an open circle at negative 2.5, just like we said, that would be about right here, more or less, and you put an open circle at positive 2.5, which is more or less right here. And then what you're saying, if you read it this direction out, x is greater than negative 2.5, x is less than positive 2.5, so this is going to be the answer, is going to be all the values in between. All right, so it's probably a good idea to, and this is what you would circle, by the way, on your test, that's what you would circle, and if you had to graph it, this is what you would graph. It's probably a good idea to put a few values in here and see if it works. Let's start with 0, that's the easiest thing. If you put 0 in here, if you take the absolute value of that, that is less than 2.5. Let's say you put negative 2 in here. Negative 2, take the absolute value of that, is positive 2, which is less than 2.5. If you put, let's say, positive 1.5 here, positive 1.5, absolute value of that's less than 2.5. So you can see that all of these values do indeed satisfy this inequality. All right, let that circle around your brain a little bit, what we're saying when we translate this statement into this and kind of problem that looks like a segment of a range of values that satisfy the solution. And move on with me to the next problem. Let's go ahead and grab this. We'll use it as we solve the next problem. And the next problem is going to be very similar. It'll be a little bit more complicated. Y plus 5 inside the absolute value greater than 8. So mentally, when you look at a problem like this, you should say whatever's inside is basically going to be less than 2.5 units away from the origin. That's how you write that down. All right? When you read something like this, the way you mentally read it is whatever's inside has got to be greater than 8 units from the origin. Because whatever this is equal to has to be, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 in order